life and death, eros and thanatos, desire and fear, the body and the soul. These are the dialectical opposites that have to be reconciled in any account of the human sush. Freud, in his theorizing, discovered relatively late on in his process the relevance of the death instinct and its vicissitude aggression to the diagnosis of his patient's maladies. For many rationalist philosophers, the life, sush, instinct must be a primary form of being there in the world, and any essence-specifying definition of life must refer to the fundamental telos of this power, namely, that it must come to an end in that state we call death. The proposition that all life is mortal must, that is, connect the concepts of life and death inextricably. The phenomenon of death is mysterious, and as such demands a complex form of explanation, which does not deny the essential nature of life. Paul Ricoeur, in his work on Freud and philosophy, an essay in interpretation, translated by Savage, D., New Haven, Yale University Press, 1970, claims that we, the human form of sush, are creatures possessed of desires, which are both disguised and revealed in different ways and in different situations. These desires belong to a cycle of life which in its turn expresses an ancient theme of mythology and philosophy, namely the mystery of the infinite and its relation to being. Campbell in his essay refers to the mythical cycle of the movement of the Zodiac constellation, a movement which apparently takes 432,000 years to complete. These constellations never cease moving, of course, and will continue their motion forever, or at least for very long periods of time. The journey of the constellations reach a point without resting, and continue on their journey. Were this to be the journey of a life form, one may well reach a point on a cyclical journey which one recognizes to be a beginning, and recognize it to be such, perhaps also, as T.S. Eliot claims, knowing it for the first time. 432,000 years ago is a period in which Homo sapiens did not exist, but earlier hominid forms did. It is not surprising, however, that the Greek astronomers during the time of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and previously, observed celestial phenomena with the awe and wonder normally reserved for the divinities of their mythological narratives. For some reason unknown to us, the ancients regarded this number of 432,000 as something with mystical, magical, occult powers, and we find even the philosopher Plato talking about this magic number in his work, The Republic. This connection of zodiac animal shapes and forms to numbers remind us, of course, both of the animals we find in the darkness of primitive caves, and the Platonic journey out of the dark cave of our ignorance into the enlightening sunlight, where other forms begin to attract our attention, and numbers are used to measure out our life in coffee spoons. The Republic, of course, sought to overthrow the world of superstition in favor of a knowledge-based world, where the form of the good was the primary principle of human existence. Yet even here, in this work, we find noble lies, and reliance on allegories to explain the mysteries connected to the human form of sush. Another later rationalist, Spinoza, speculating about the problem of being qua being, which revealed itself to his understanding as something infinite in form, eternal and self-causing, claimed that everything in the universe is striving to maintain itself in existence. The smallest speck of dust floating in a shaft of sunlight is striving to find its resting place, as are all objects under the sun. Spinoza argues that philosophy is capable of enabling us to view the world sub specie eternitatis, in spite of our propensity to view the world as a series of beginnings and endings in which entities come into existence and go out of existence. He argues, that is, that the idea of being as a whole can be both revealed and disguised in our everyday dealings with the world. The matter of sush accumulates in one location, and life supervenes at the beginning of a psychic journey, where along the way various capacities and powers form, and perhaps build upon other capacities and powers in accordance with hylomorphic forms or principles. In the course of this actualization process on the road to the end of the journey, a curious phenomenon occurs. We encounter individuals who wish for nothing more than to rewrap this gift of life and return it to its material source. This phenomenon appears to call into question the claim made by Spinoza that all entities strive to maintain themselves in their current state of existence, perhaps in the human form, or even transcending it. Appearances, we have learned from the philosophers, can be deceptive. Paul Ricoeur claims that as a man possessed by desire, we often go forth in disguise, and this may be what the Greek oracles had in mind when they proclaimed that acquiring self-knowledge was the most desirable of all philosophical quests. Life undoubtedly is a good in itself, and also something that is good in its consequences, if Aristotle is indeed correct in saying that all of man's activity aims at the good. If the end of life is good, and life is a good in itself, then death as a consequence of life must also be a good, as Socrates proclaimed from his death cell. This is a departure from the position that death is only in very special circumstances a good outcome. One of the logical consequences of life being a good in itself is the Kantian argument that using life to take a life is a practical contradiction, and this applies especially to oneself. If this position is correct, then the desire to commit suicide cannot as such be possible, and must be another disguised desire. Joseph Campbell touches upon this issue and refers to Schopenhauer's essay on the foundations of morality, where the enigmatic phenomenon of men who jeopardize their own existence to save the lives of others is discussed, a phenomenon which appears on the face of it to question Spinoza's claim that all entities strive to maintain themselves in their existence. Campbell, in relation to this discussion, cites a personal experience in Hawaii where someone attempting to commit suicide by jumping off a cliff is rescued by two passing police officers, one of whom were, in the process, almost pulled off the cliff to a certain death. This type of phenomenon, Campbell argues, is a symbolic phenomenon of metaphysical importance, because it reveals or shows that men possess unconscious knowledge that all living human beings share an essence which is more important than our distinctness or separateness from one another. Campbell also refers to Kant in this discussion. But this, of course, is an idea that was already implicit for Schopenhauer in Kant's critique of pure reason, Part 1, in the Transcendental Aesthetic, where it is shown that the forms of sensibility, time and space, condition all of our perceptions, and that it is within this field of time and space and what Nietzsche then termed principium individuationis, the principle of individuation, is experienced. Whence it follows that whatever may underlie or be antecedent to our experiences within this field must be unity, a principle of unity, or perhaps, indeed, something even more mysterious than unity, beyond all our categories of thinking whatsoever, categories such as unity and multiplicity being but forms, finally, of our thinking. Underlying this field of multiplicity, then, there is mystery, and this is the mystery of our being, the mystery of the being of the universe, the mystery of the being of all things. Campbell then continues this discussion by referring to the Katha Upanishad, which claims that the true self that belongs to our human sush does not show itself except to those with subtle intellect. Perhaps Campbell would have included both Spinoza and Kant in this category of subtle intellects. The realm of being referred to above does not, Campbell continues, permit of the dialectic of opposites such as good and evil, life and death, etc. This realm of being qua being is not that of the Heraclitean dialectical realm of strife, but rather a more peaceful region of silence, where the opposites of motion and rest do not form part of the field of thought. Rather, under the aspect of thought, it is truth that is one and eternal. For Spinoza, substance is identified with what he calls infinite substance, which itself contains an infinite number of attributes. We finite human beings only know of this divine substance through the attributes of thought and extension. Under the attribute of extension we know of God via space, time, and matter, which we also know are infinite. Aristotle's basic metaphysical and hylomorphic term of prime form is also an attempt to explain the meaning of infinite substance for us human finite forms of being. Given the fact that all human experience is temporal, this of course produces a problem for understanding the infinity of being or substance. This prejudices our inquiry into being in favor of investigating phenomenal motion and matter in space and time, the traditional sphere of concern for materialists. Prime form, of course, is intimately connected with a divine form of thought that thinks itself. It is eternal, and causes itself to exist. Jung and Freud differ fundamentally in their differing interpretations of dreams. Freud, whilst being convinced that dreams provided him with a royal road to the unconscious, nevertheless was practically concerned with the problem of helping his patients return to the path of living and the task of leading a flourishing life. For Jung, it appears that the issue of dreams was more metaphysical and connected with mythological and religious concerns in relation to the unconscious and its determinative role in the life of man. It is remarkable to note that, in spite of their considerable differences in viewing the basic terms of psychoanalysis, both psychologists claimed that they were influenced by Kant. The dream of oneself, a 75-year-old man as a 25-year-old university student, reveals the timeless character of the unconscious. The past of the dreamer is once again made present not in the form of a memory, but in the form of a current, ongoing experience. If the dream was one involving the student looking for the location of a scheduled lecture, the different interpretations of Jung and Freud must surely suggest that there are fundamental differences of principle between the two, which in turn suggests that perhaps we should examine their claims to be influenced by Kant more carefully. Freud would be able to interpret the above dream in terms of the historical, reaching back to infancy, personal desires and fears of the patient. Jung, on the other hand, would generalize the interpretation and appeal to the desires and fears of mankind. Jung, that is, appears to believe that dreams essentially reach into the future and can be sketches of a solution to serious life problems. The ancient Greek philosophers were concerned with the power of discourse and rationality to overcome and transform those desires and fears that stand in the way of humans achieving the good-spirited, flourishing life, eudaimonia. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle were, of course, more concerned with the ethical and political problems associated with eudaimonia than its psychological or anthropological aspects. For these thinkers, and for Spinoza, episteme, arche, arete, and techne all played a part in the processes of striving to lead a good-spirited, flourishing life. Indeed, Spinoza, for example, specifically says that it is a lack of adequate ideas about our life worlds that hinders man from achieving what he strives for. One of these critical ideas is the idea of the scope and limits of the powers of our bodies, which Spinoza claims is the first idea in our minds. Adequate ideas are, of course, constituted of both an understanding of the categories of thought and appropriate principles. The body is the bearer of our passions and emotions, and Spinoza produces excellent accounts of the principles underlying our understanding of these states and processes found in human sush. Insofar as man is striving, not just to maintain himself in existence, but for perfection, he is steered by the pleasure-pain principle and the reality principle, if we are to use Freudian terms. Pleasure, for Spinoza, occurs when man attains a greater degree of perfection, and pain when man is diminished in his perfection. Man therefore lives for those things that contribute to his desire for perfection, and hates those things which significantly diminish his perfection. Spinoza argues that it is the essence of being human to desire this perfection of being human, which, of course, will not be divine, but rather merely resemble the divine state of perfection. He also argues that, given the fact that love is intimately connected to seeking a higher state of perfection, and given the fact that there can be no higher state of perfection than that which is divine, we humans can certainly love God, but God can neither love nor hate us, because his perfection is not alterable. So when the Bible claims that God so loved mankind that he sent his Son down to save us from ourselves, the term love must have a metaphorical sense. For Spinoza, then, having adequate ideas of God and adequate ideas of our own bodies and minds are all necessary to lead the good-spirited, flourishing life referred to earlier. Acting in accordance with inadequate ideas, he also argues, is typical of emotional states where perceptions and imagination play a large role in our understanding of what we are doing. The tools of our understanding and reason are more likely to bring about agreement with our fellows than our actions motivated by the passions, it is argued. Aristotle touches upon the role of the emotions in his work on tragedy, in particular the emotions of pity and fear, which, as we all know, occur in particular circumstances, have particular bodily symptoms and characteristic behavior. Aristotle attributes to the tragic poets the task of the catharsis of these emotions, which amounts to ensuring that we feel both pity and fear in the right way at the right time. Art is not just driven by reason, but also uses pleasure and pain in order to envelop its audience in its project by deliberately evoking these emotions, and guiding them in accordance with adequate aesthetic and rational, ethical, ideas. Art, it is maintained, imitates life, but insofar as it does use adequate ideas of the emotions and relate to rational desires of man, it performs an important function in our lives, namely, that of contributing to a better understanding of our human essence or our human nature. Reason enables us, Spinoza argues, to view the world and ourselves under an aspect of eternity, sub specie eternitatis, thus transcending the constraints of space, time, and matter. This is a similar position to that we find in both the Aristotelian and Kantian accounts of the divine, which Ricoeur characterizes as the realm of the sacred. In the case of Aristotle, we glimpse the perfection of God eternally thinking, via use of a part of the mind he called noos, that reveals the divine primary form, only through a glass darkly. God's thinking, we have stated, is a thinking about thinking, and this is to be distinguished from our human form of thought which, because it is situated in space and time, can only think something about something. In this latter form of thought, a particular located in space and time is conceptualized in accordance with certain categories of thought and principles of reason. An example of the above form of thinking is captured in the proposition, all men are mortal, which we regard as a conceptual truth, a truth whose contradiction does not make any sense. Aristotle's emotions of pity and fear are certainly tied up with a lack of understanding of death, and the theme of death has been a concern of the poets, priests, and philosophers throughout the ages. According to Christianity, a proper catharsis of the emotions of pity and fear would require, for example, loving both our neighbor and enemies, on the grounds that we all participate equally in being a human form of life, sush. This brings us back to our example of the dust particle floating in a shaft of light. Spinoza believes that the particle is striving to maintain itself in its existence, but this particle differs in one essential respect from any life form associated with sush, namely, it is inert, not capable of causing itself to do what it is doing. The explanation of its behavior will reside in a summation of external causes. Forms of life are, on the contrary, self-determining, and to a greater degree less determined by external causes. We are dealing here with items from two different kingdoms of being, namely, the mineral kingdom whose primary characteristic is its inertness, and the animal kingdom whose motions are determined by internal self-causing desires and beliefs. There is, however, a relation between these two kingdoms which is suggested by the biblical lamentation that we are dust, and to dust we shall return. Philosophers have argued that I cannot doubt the fact that I am going to die, and because I believe all men are mortal, I cannot doubt that other humans will also die someday. This might explain why I care deeply about the loss of human life, and perhaps also care about the loss of the love of others close to me. This care about loss, for Freud, could take the forms of both mourning and melancholia, and it is significant that in Freud's theorizing, he sought for a particular mechanism to explain why, in the case of mourning over the loss of a life through the act of suicide, we care so deeply that someone took their own life in defiance of Spinoza's reference to the essential human desire to preserve its own form of existence. Kant, too, embraced this thesis when he claimed that it is a practical contradiction to use one's life to take that same life, thus placing life clearly in the category of things that are good in themselves. Life, then, in both mythological and philosophical contexts, has a defined position in the realm of the sacred, in a way in which the dust particle floating in a shaft of sunlight does not, even if it too, might become the focus of awe and wonder. This, of course, might occur if we see that it might be connected to life in the way the Bible suggests. We are dust, and to dust we shall return. An interesting footnote to add here is that pollen, so essential to the maintenance of the existence of plant life, cannot be seen in a shaft of light, and we might need a microscope to detect its presence. This reminds us of the limitations of our sensory perception, which, in turn, reminds us of our finitude. Pollen, of course, insofar as it affects humans with allergies, might not, as far as they are concerned, evoke the feelings of awe and wonder that might otherwise be associated with it. There is, though, the Indian myth of the pollen path that must have evoked feelings of awe and wonder for those who know this myth. It might be argued that, given our reliance on food that is grown, the plant kingdom is of greater interest for us than the occupants of the world of minerals. The primary phenomenon that excites our interest in all kingdoms is change or motion in the context of space and time, and Aristotle's hylomorphic theory of change, referring as it does to four kinds of change, three media of change, space, time and matter, three principles of change and four causes of change, forms an essential framework for explaining why change occurs in the form that it does. This framework is then utilized in three different kinds of science, theoretical, practical, productive, to form theories about the domains these sciences are concerned with. Aristotle's hylomorphic theory, that is, provides us with a categorical framework which is regulated by the principles of logic, e.g. non-contradiction and sufficient reason. Campbell's references to both Spinoza and Kant are interesting and significant, but he omits consideration of Kant's third critique, the critique of judgment, in his discussions. In the introduction to the section entitled Critique of Teleological Judgment, Kant claims, "The possibility of a living matter is quite inconceivable. The very conception of it involves self-contradiction, since lifelessness, inertia, constitutes the essential characteristic of matter." Page 46. If Spinoza's position is categorized as hylozoism, which still remains an open question given the convolutions and nuances of Spinoza's theory, such a position would be rejected categorically by Kant, and possibly by Aristotle too, in his later reflections, on grounds similar to those assumed by Linnaeus. The ancient Greek term sush, it has been argued in an earlier work, is categorically distinct from the inert world of matter and artifacts. Kant's teleological reflections elaborate in more detail upon Spinoza's account of infinite substance, which, for Kant, was one way of referring to God, or the underlying principle of change and motion in the universe. The connection of the scientific concept of substance to matter in space and time, however, might confuse the issue, and this requires that we must specifically designate the substance talked about by Aristotle, Spinoza, and Kant as a technical philosophical concept. The idea of God for Aristotle, Spinoza, Kant, and mythology has no connection with scientific concerns of any kind, even if we know that Spinoza was one of Einstein's favorite philosophers. Campbell's suggestion that there is an affinity between the Kantian idea of God and some mythological ideas is certainly valid. He might well have referred to the following passage in Kant to support his argument. We cannot conceive or render intelligible to ourselves the finality which must be introduced as the basis even of our knowledge of the intrinsic possibility of many material things, except by representing it, and, in general, the world as the product of an intelligent cause, in short, of a God. Page 53. Kant claims further that the above kind of reasoning is also necessary for the conceptualization of living forms, because it is, quite certain that we can never get a sufficient knowledge of organized beings and their inner possibility, much less get an explanation of them, by looking merely to mechanical principles of nature. Indeed, so certain is it, that we may confidently assert that it is absurd for men even to entertain any thought of so doing, or to hope that another Newton may some day arise to make intelligible to us even the genesis of but a blade of grass from natural laws that no designer has ordered. Such insight we must absolutely deny to mankind. Page 54. An adequate idea of God, then, lies beyond the scope of human knowledge, but it can nevertheless be thought and regulated by the principles of non-contradiction and sufficient reason. The idea, therefore, is not objectively valid, but nevertheless can be attributed to all judging subjects who possess the powers of sensibility, understanding, and reason. There can never be, according to Kant, any sensible presentation of God, and as a consequence, no conclusive proof of his existence, but because we are thinking, speaking beings, we can think and judge that it is God who guarantees the validity of moral judgments relating to the character and future of mankind. God, that is, according to Kant, guarantees that virtuous behavior will be its own reward, even if in many other respects we might find our life wanting. In a very special sense, then, the kinds of judgments we make about God are subjective, in the aesthetic sense. Nevertheless, we speak with a universal voice about God, and we can motivate what we say with moral arguments. In theoretical contexts, Kant also relates noumenal reality to God as an idea of pure reason. Noumenal reality is defined as the non-sensible something containing the ultimate ground of the world of sense, page 139. The objects connected with these ideas of God, the immortality of the soul, are, Kant argues, matters of faith, page 143, which is characterized in the following way. Faith as habitus, not as actus, is the moral attitude of reason in its assurance of the truth of what is beyond the reach of theoretical knowledge. It is the steadfast principle of the mind, therefore, according to which the truth of what must necessarily be presupposed as the condition of the supreme final end being possible is assumed as true in consideration of the fact that we are under an obligation to pursue that end. Pages 145 to 6. If we shift our focus to the practical, bearing in mind that in theoretical contexts concerned with the truth, God is an idea of the mind which we must have faith in, given the arguments. This is a shift away from the abstract truth of the matter, and towards the form of the good, and in this practical realm, freedom is the primary practical idea of reason, which Kant claims has objective reality. Freedom is the one and only conception of the supersensible which, owing to the causality implied in it, proves its objective reality in nature by its possible effect there. By this means it makes possible the connection of the two other ideas with nature, and the connection of all three to form a religion. Page 149. This is the reasoning that makes freedom the primary focus for Kant's answer to the questions, what can we hope for? And what is a human being? And this is why Kant is the metaphysical philosopher par excellence of the Enlightenment. God is not abolished from his supersensible reflections, but rather is an idea that is used to justify the free exercise of our duties, along with the categorical imperative in its various formulations. The personal end of a good-spirited flourishing life is, then, further connected to a teleological cosmopolitan kingdom of ends, which may or may not actualize over the period of the next 100,000 years. The theoretical idea of the immortality of the soul is, of course, a major concern for mythology and religion, and therefore for Campbell in his reflections. It is in this context that he considers the very profane and secular act of committing suicide that Kant regarded as a practical misuse of our freedom, a practical contradiction which he expressed in terms of the ought-judgment man ought not to use his life to take his life. If, in dying, we merely passed into another form of afterlife which is better than this one, why, it could be asked, would religions that believe in the afterlife prohibit suicide? It could, of course, be argued that life is so precious that only God with his divine judgment could adequately decide whether that life should be ended. This makes sense, and gives theological weight to the verdict of an inquest, that John Doe committed suicide whilst the balance of his mind was disturbed. A more Freudian reading, however, may refer to a weakened ego submitting to the influence of a superego, turning aggression inward in accordance with a death instinct. The pain and suffering of John Doe obviously, in this case, distorted the operation of the reality principle which normally acts in accordance with the desire to continue living, because living, as Aristotle testifies, is an absolute good or end in itself. This, in turn, entails that if we understand Sush, in Spinoza's terms, and have an adequate idea of what life is, we must realize that death is an absolute and final end to any particular life, partly because a mind without an idea of a living body is no longer a mind. A corpse is a dead body. It is not alive. It is, that is, logically impossible, the logic of practical reason, that death, real death, not false alarms where the heart may stop and someone helps to start his beating again, but real alarms for those witnessing the event, and perhaps for whom the psychological loss will mean considerable suffering during a period of mourning, is not an absolute good, as Socrates claimed. The ambiguous descriptions of experiencing the occult other side could never be validated, because the experiencer did not, in any sense, know what it was they were experiencing. There is a discussion in psychology relating to out-of-body experiences, and many textbooks on the subject do not commit themselves to a position, because they do not have adequate ideas of the power of the body. There are, it is maintained in this context, recorded testimonies of people experiencing what they call the other side, whilst being operated upon when their heart stops. It seems something of them floats upwards to watch proceedings they even subsequently seem to be able to relatively accurately describe, in spite of being under anesthetic. We know under anesthetic that there are levels of unconsciousness, and we know that at certain levels of unconsciousness we dream, and we also know some dreams relate rather specifically to what is actually going on in the body. Given these facts, it is not out of the question that some kind of bodily awareness of what is happening is being transformed on the dream screen into realistic images. Freud testifies to the existence of these types of dreams in his Interpretation of Dreams. The psyche attains in sleep a much more profound and wide-ranging sensory consciousness of its bodily nature than it does when awake, and cannot but receive and be affected by impressions of certain stimuli that originates in parts of the body, and in changes there, which it was unaware of when awake. Strumpel, 1877. Aristotle, Freud points out, claims that certain illnesses can be foretold in dreams, namely, those that relate to sensations connected to these illnesses that have as yet not supervened in the patient. Campbell, we noted in an earlier essay, subscribes to the hylomorphic thesis that the sensations and impressions relating to organs can connect to the imagination. In his story about the two heroic police officers saving someone from committing suicide, Campbell noted that the man who was saved was, paradoxically, grateful to the two officers for saving his life, and this would seem to support our position thus far. Life is sacred, and must have some sort of absolute value in our humanly populated world. The man who is dead is the man for whom the ultimate and final event that can happen to a man has happened, namely the event of death. This event practically means that the memory system has recorded its last memory, consciousness has made its last appearance, and no exercises of any other psychological powers can occur. The dead body, the corpse, can of course be observed by others, but it will no longer move, unless it is being moved by some force outside it. We cannot sensibly say that the soul has been freed or liberated, or has gone to heaven. Indeed, the Socratic description of death being a dreamless sleep is apt as a metaphorical characterization of this event of death that happens to everyone and is characterized well by the judgment. All men are mortal,